Oklahoma, 2009. A family of 3 drives into the mountains and never returns. Their truck is found abandoned, with cash, phones, and a starving dog still inside, while security footage shows their final hours moving in eerie silence. If you enjoy real investigations and dark true stories, subscribe, like, and share. Let's begin. Oklahoma, October 2009. The Jamison family lived a quiet life in the small town of Eufaula, a place surrounded by open land, wooded hills, and long roads that seemed to disappear into the horizon. Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilynn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison were not known as adventurous people. They kept mostly to themselves, and like many families in rural America, they dreamed of starting fresh somewhere more isolated, away from stress and everyday conflict. In the weeks leading up to their disappearance, they had been discussing a major change. They wanted to buy a piece of land in the mountains of southeastern Oklahoma, near the San Boys Range, an area known for its dense forests, winding dirt roads, and limited cell service. The region offered privacy and space, but it also carried a reputation for being unforgiving to anyone unprepared for its terrain. On the morning they left, nothing appeared dramatically unusual from the outside. The family packed their white pickup truck and headed toward the mountains to inspect the property they were considering purchasing. The trip was supposed to be short, possibly even routine, a simple drive to look at land and return home later that day. Yet people who later examined their lives described growing tension within the household. There were reports of financial stress, health concerns, and emotional strain that may have weighed heavily on the couple. Some acquaintances suggested the family had become increasingly withdrawn in the months before the trip, though no one imagined that the outing would become their last known movement. The road leading into the mountains became narrower the farther they drove, surrounded by thick trees and steep slopes. It was the kind of place where silence felt heavy, broken only by wind through the branches or the distant sound of wildlife. For many, the landscape was peaceful. For others, it felt isolated enough to hide secrets. At some point during that day, the Jamison family reached the area where they planned to view the land. What happened next remains unknown. There were no emergency calls, no witnesses who reported seeing an argument, and no clear indication that anything was wrong. The family simply disappeared. When they failed to return home, concern began to grow among relatives and neighbors. Days passed without contact. Calls went unanswered. There were no signs that they had checked into a hotel or traveled elsewhere. It was as if the family had stepped off the map entirely. Search efforts soon began to focus on the mountainous area they were known to have visited. The terrain made searching difficult, with thick vegetation and uneven ground limiting visibility. Investigators hoped they were dealing with a simple case of a family lost in remote wilderness. But when authorities finally located the Jamisons' truck, the scene they encountered would raise far more questions than answers. The vehicle was parked on an isolated forest road, not far from the land they intended to purchase. It was locked. Inside were the family's personal belongings: phones, wallets, identification, and something else that immediately alarmed investigators. The family's dog, weak and close to starvation, still alive inside the vehicle. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no obvious evidence of violence, and beneath the driver's seat, hidden from plain view, was a large amount of cash. Nothing about the scene suggested a robbery or a sudden escape. Instead, it looked as though the family had stepped away from the truck voluntarily and never returned. For investigators, the question became immediate and unsettling. Why would an entire family abandon their vehicle, leaving behind money, phones, and even their dog in the middle of a remote mountain area? The answer would only become stranger as new evidence began to emerge. When investigators reached the Jamison family's pickup truck, the scene felt strangely ordinary at first glance. The vehicle was parked along a narrow forest road, surrounded by dense trees and uneven ground, the kind of place where few people passed by unless they specifically knew where they were going. There were no broken windows, no signs of forced entry, and no obvious evidence suggesting panic or violence. Inside, however, the details quickly turned the case into a mystery. The family's wallets and identification were still in the truck. Their mobile phones had been left behind as well, unusual for a family traveling in unfamiliar terrain where communication would be important. Under the driver's seat, investigators discovered approximately $32,000 in cash, hidden but untouched. The presence of such a large amount of money immediately complicated the investigation. If the family had been attacked or robbed, why would the cash remain? Even more disturbing was the condition of the family's dog. The animal had been left inside the vehicle, weak and dehydrated, but still alive. Veterinarians later estimated that it had survived for days without proper food or water. To detectives, this suggested that whatever caused the family to leave the truck had happened suddenly, or that they believed they would return quickly. The truck itself offered few clues. There were no footprints clearly leading away, no discarded items along the nearby road, and no indication that another vehicle had been involved. It appeared as though the Jamisons had simply stepped out and disappeared into the surrounding wilderness. Search teams expanded their efforts across the area. Volunteers and law enforcement combed the forests and mountain trails, expecting to find signs that the family had gotten lost or injured. The terrain, however, made searching difficult. Steep slopes, thick vegetation, and isolated paths created countless places where someone could vanish without being easily seen. As investigators looked deeper into the family's background, they discovered pieces of information that added layers of complexity rather than clarity. Reports suggested that Bobby and Sherilynn had experienced personal and financial difficulties. Some acquaintances described tension between them, while others insisted they were simply trying to start over in a quieter place. Still, none of those details explained the strange circumstances surrounding the truck. The combination of abandoned valuables, a starving dog, and the lack of any obvious struggle created a scene that didn't fit typical missing person cases. For detectives, one possibility seemed increasingly likely. The key to understanding what happened might not be in the mountains at all. It might be found in the family's final hours before they left home. When investigators reviewed surveillance footage taken at the Jamison residence on the day of their departure, they expected to see a normal family preparing for a trip. Instead, what they saw would become one of the most unsettling elements of the entire case. The recording showed Bobby and Sherilynn moving back and forth between the house and the truck repeatedly, carrying items in and out for nearly an hour. Their movements were slow and methodical. They barely spoke to one another. At times, they appeared distant, almost disconnected, as if operating on automatic behavior rather than conversation or purpose. For those who watched the footage, the scene felt deeply unusual, not dramatic, but quietly disturbing. Investigators would later describe the couple as looking almost as if they were in a trance. And the more people watched those recordings, the more unsettling questions began to form. What had happened to them before they ever reached the mountains? And why did their final moments at home feel so eerily detached from reality? As investigators searched for explanations, The most unsettling clue did not come from the mountains or the abandoned truck. It came from security cameras installed outside the Jamison home, recording the family's final known hours before they disappeared. The footage showed Bobby and Sherilynn moving in and out of the house repeatedly over the course of nearly an hour. At first glance, nothing dramatic happened. There were no visible arguments, no signs of urgency, and no indication that they were being followed or threatened. Yet the longer the footage played, the more unusual it appeared. The couple carried items to the truck one piece at a time, then returned inside, only to repeat the same movements again and again. Some of the objects seemed unnecessary or random, as if they were packing without a clear plan. Their body language stood out to investigators and later to the public when details of the footage became widely discussed. They barely spoke to each other. They did not appear rushed. Their movements seemed slow, deliberate, almost mechanical. Observers described the scene as strangely emotionless, as if the couple were functioning on autopilot. Some viewers later said they looked disoriented or exhausted, while others believed they appeared detached from their surroundings entirely. The absence of normal interaction, no visible conversation, no gestures suggesting planning or coordination, became one of the most debated elements of the case. Investigators did not officially label their behavior as suspicious, but they acknowledged that the footage was unusual. It created more questions than answers. Were the Jamisons simply tired after a long day? Were they under stress? Or was something affecting them that cameras could not reveal? Speculation quickly followed. Some theorized the family might have been experiencing emotional or psychological strain that influenced their behavior. Others suggested possible drug use, though no evidence was ever confirmed to support that explanation. More extreme theories pointed toward paranoia, belief in supernatural threats, or involvement with unknown groups. None of these ideas were supported by definitive evidence, but the footage's eerie tone invited endless interpretation. What made the video so powerful was not what they showed, but what they failed to show. There was no clear trigger for alarm, no visible danger, just a family preparing for a trip in a way that felt subtly wrong. For investigators, the recordings changed the perspective of the case. The disappearance no longer looked like a simple accident in the wilderness. Instead, it raised the possibility that something had already been unfolding before the family ever left home. As search efforts continued, months turned into years. The mountains held their silence, offering no clear sign of where the Jamisons had gone. The case slowly transformed into a cold investigation, fueled by theories but lacking solid evidence. And while the footage continued to circulate, one question remained impossible to answer. Were the cameras capturing a family going about an ordinary routine, or recording the beginning of something they no longer controlled? For nearly 4 years, there would be no resolution, until a chance discovery in the woods brought the mystery back into the light and made it even more difficult to explain. After the discovery of the abandoned truck, search teams combed the surrounding mountains for days, then weeks, hoping to find signs that the Jamison family had simply become lost or injured. The terrain was difficult and unpredictable, filled with steep slopes, dense vegetation, and narrow trails that could easily disorient anyone unfamiliar with the area. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of the family was found. As time passed, the investigation gradually lost momentum. Without evidence of violence or clear direction, the case began to drift into uncertainty. Authorities explored multiple possibilities, but each theory seemed to collapse under scrutiny. One idea suggested the family may have encountered harsh environmental conditions, and succumbed to exposure. Another proposed that they might have left the truck voluntarily to explore the land and became disoriented in the wilderness. Yet these explanations failed to account for why they would leave behind essential items such as their phones, money, and even their dog. Speculation soon spread beyond official investigations. Media coverage and online discussions introduced increasingly strange theories. Some focused on the family's personal struggles, pointing to financial pressures and reported tension within the household. Others highlighted Sherilynn's writings and interests, suggesting she believed their home was spiritually disturbed or that unseen forces were influencing their lives. None of these claims could be confirmed, but they added a layer of mystery that kept the case alive in public imagination. The surveillance footage continued to haunt investigators and viewers alike. The slow, silent movements of the couple became the subject of constant analysis, with people searching for hidden clues or subtle signs of distress. Some described the footage as eerie but explainable, perhaps simply the result of fatigue or stress. Others believed it captured something far more unsettling, a family acting under pressure that could not be seen on camera. Years passed with no answers. Seasons changed, the forest reclaimed pathways, and the story of the missing family began to fade from headlines. For many, the Jamisons became another unsolved disappearance, filed away in a cabinet of unanswered cases. Yet the mountains remained silent witnesses to whatever had happened. Somewhere within those woods, investigators believed the truth still existed, waiting to be uncovered. Then, nearly 4 years after the family vanished, a group of hunters made a discovery that would reopen the case overnight. Deep in the wilderness, several kilometers from where the truck had been found, they came across skeletal remains lying close together on the ground. The Jamison family had finally been located, but instead of providing answers, the discovery only deepened the mystery. In 2013, nearly 4 years after the Jamison family disappeared, hunters moving through a remote section of the Oklahoma wilderness made a discovery that immediately drew investigators back to a case many believed would never be solved. Hidden among thick vegetation, several kilometers from the abandoned truck, were skeletal remains lying close together on the ground. The remains were soon identified as Bobby, Sherilynn, and their daughter Madison. The scene raised as many questions as it answered. The three were found near each other, positioned face down in the earth, suggesting they had died in close proximity, rather than becoming separated while lost in the forest. There were no obvious signs of violence visible at the site, and the condition of the remains made it difficult for forensic experts to determine exactly how they had died. Autopsies could not establish a clear cause of death. Years of exposure to weather and wildlife had erased crucial evidence, leaving investigators without the physical clues needed to reconstruct their final moments. Toxicology tests offered no definitive explanation, and there were no clear indications of assault or foul play that could be proven. The unanswered questions quickly multiplied. Why had the family left the truck and traveled several kilometers into difficult terrain without food, water, or communication devices? Why abandon a vehicle that still contained money, identification, and even their dog? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what had prompted them to walk into the wilderness together in the first place? Theories continued to circulate. Some believed the family may have become disoriented after leaving the vehicle, succumbing to harsh conditions. Others suggested psychological distress or paranoia may have influenced their decisions. More extreme ideas involved criminal involvement, drug-related explanations, or fear of something unknown. Yet none of these theories could be confirmed by evidence. Investigators eventually acknowledged that the case might never be fully understood. The timeline between the family leaving their home and their final moments in the mountains remained fragmented, held together only by speculation and a handful of disturbing clues. What endured was the image captured on surveillance cameras. A family moving slowly, silently, as if separated from reality even before their journey began. Combined with the abandoned truck and the unexplained walk into the wilderness, the footage transformed the case from a missing person investigation into something more unsettling, a mystery defined by behavior that defied easy explanation. Today, the Jamison case remains officially unresolved. No clear cause of death has been determined, and no definitive evidence has emerged to explain why the family disappeared or what happened during their final hours. The mountains of Oklahoma have long since returned to quiet, but the questions remain unchanged. Did the family lose their way in the wilderness, or were they already lost long before they left home?